everyone. Welcome to Brothers, Sisters, Strangers video podcast. I'm Ali John Chaudhary, psychotherapist. And today we have a very special episode. Fern and I really want to get into narcissistic traits and sibling estrangement. So this is something we've been talking about doing for a while now because this is such an important topic. We hear about narcissism everywhere in society. It's coming into the public conversation, and we really want to delve deeper into this. So we wanted to contextualize this with regards to sibling estrangement because this is so important because so many of us have experienced this on some level or another. So we're going to get into this in this series on narcissism. So thanks so much for being here, Fern.
It is great to be with you as always. And narcissism is an interesting component of sibling estrangement. And the reason I'm familiar with this is when I was writing my book, Brothers, Sisters, Strangers, I did a survey of about 120 or 30 people. And I asked specifically about what they think has contributed to the problem of sibling estrangement. Many identified narcissism as the driver. So I think it's important that we discuss this. First of all, many people don't even know how to recognize narcissism, and they don't identify some of their siblings as having this. Once the light bulb goes off and they see what it is, it's a whole different ballgame.
Absolutely, I completely agree with you. I think that once we identify some of the traits that are more present with regards to narcissism, I think that this is something that our viewers could very much use to be able to get an idea about what they've been going through and perhaps have a bit of a checklist in terms of maybe what's been causing some problems for them with regards to narcissistic behaviors with their sibling.
And it's such a severe problem that it forces each of us to evaluate whether we can move forward in a relationship with somebody who's narcissistic, because you're likely to get injured over and over again. So that's why I think it's a very important topic. Number one, so people can identify what it is. And number two, to decide whether maybe this relationship is just so toxic that you need to cut it off.
I agree. I think that it's important to recognize just what can be problematic in a relationship. And again, it's about helping us in some ways make decisions about, what we want to invest in and what we want to be careful with in terms of where the traps can lie. And maybe we can get into some of the traits that are present with narcissists. I think that that's important that we explore this because I think that a lot of us just don't realize sometimes at which point it can be problematic. And there's actually been a study with regards to a tool that a lot of people use in psychology called the Pathological Narcissism Inventory. And it goes into some of the traits that some of our viewers may actually find very familiar in their own experience. So what I wanted to just share is I think that one of the major traits is contingent self-esteem. And this is where the narcissist tends to want to feel good about themselves by relying largely on how others perceive them. So that you'll often find people constantly justifying themselves, with regards to the other person. And that's kind of what they cause other people around them to do. So because they want to have that admiration, they want to have that validation that narcissistic supply.
So what's skewed about that is that we shouldn't be looking outside of ourselves for a sense of well-being. We should be getting that from inside ourselves. And people who are narcissistic are looking for others to lift up who they are and how they interact in the world. So they're constantly looking for that supply for somebody to make them feel like they're valued.
Absolutely, and it has to do with just not giving any other people room for their own personality. It's all about them. They become basically the biggest person in the room, and that's kind of what they do is they depend on that type of validation for themselves. And so much so that they tend to become exploitative, which is another trait that they have. And exploitativeness is basically the sense of not really caring about using anybody to justify the ends. And that's kind of what they tend to do in a lot of cases where they may be abusive and get into dominant power games just to kind of rise and be on top, and just to feel good about themselves. So,
and it seems to me that their interactions are very transactional. So when you start to feel that this is not reciprocated, there isn't a mutuality in a relationship, that's kind of a red flag.
it is a red flag because basically, you know, there'll be all sorts of things like shame shifting, manipulation, criticism, blame, denial, even making themselves into a victim just to get that type of attention, gaslighting, as we said before. Yeah, those type of different experiences that people feel are left leaving them depleted, especially after being with a narcissist, are especially red flags.
But I want to say right here that it's not like the narcissist cannot show empathy or compassion at all. And a lot of times I think people get trapped in particularly romantic relationships because they get love bombed, or and in the beginning it's a very intoxicating and fulfilling experience because you're getting a lot of attention. The problem is it flips.
Exactly. And that's the thing, is once the narcissist has the sense that the other person is under their wing, basically what they'll do is they can basically flip that very, very easily. And as you said, you know, they can be very charming. They can be very, very empathic, and in some ways demonstrate that, but it's all done for the sense of feeding their ego, feeding themselves. It's instrumental to feeling good about themselves. Well, it's not done authentically. It's done strategically as a means of exploitation.
You know, Alejandra, you remind me, I have a daughter who is an adult now, but when she was just starting to date men, I used to always give her the same advice. And the advice was, they can say anything. Don't look at what they're saying. Don't listen to what they're saying. Watch what they're doing. Because the actions are so much more revealing than the words.
Yes, yes. And that's very true, because I think that if you watch the actions of people, then you'll know essentially who they are. People will tell you who they are based on the choices they make, the actions they take. So that's very important to be able to see that. So I agree with you entirely. And I think that also they tend to self-enhance themselves a lot, and that means they'll have an unrealistically positive view of themselves, right? So they tend to overestimate or overassess their ability and status, in which they somehow will really make themselves look and try to exteriorize that quality of seeing themselves as the greatest person they can be. So they're typically they have a very high self-esteem, but what they do is that you can't have a certain sense of authenticity that comes out of that, because they tend to always kind of fall into one of those patterns where they can lash out if people don't give them that sense of reflecting back how they see themselves as being the person they think they are.
I want to say a couple things here, and one is obviously narcissism is on a spectrum, just like all of these mental disorders. So some people might be somewhat narcissistic and some might be full blown. There are also, within the broad category of narcissism, there are different types of narcissists. So you get the covert narcissist, or the malignant narcissist, or the community narcissist. And those things are so confusing and deceptive. So for example, the one that really always gets to me is somebody who is a real do-gooder, but is actually deriving their sense of importance from how they contribute and how they're perceived in the community.
Yes, and that's an important one also, the notion of the altruistic narcissist. I think that we may in a future episode explore some of these different types of narcissism, especially because I think that it's especially important, because under the guise of empathy, it can look as if somebody is a do-gooder, but in the end, it's all about boosting themselves. And you can see, for example, a lot of people in power positions, such as cult leaders, for example, that will tend to look as if they're doing good, but it's really not about that in the end. So
what a trap!
It's true. And I just want to say also, you're absolutely right with regards to being on a spectrum and such with narcissism. You're right, because it's not our place to diagnose people here, and nor should other people do that. It's really not about doing that, but it's about recognizing the traits that are present with regards to that, because traits can be present without it being a full-blown diagnosis. So let's just be very conscious about that. Now, another trait that we can have also that's present is the hiding of the self. And this is the type of frailties that the narcissists don't want to have come out. And what happens in cases like that is, if they feel as if their faults and their needs come out in some ways, it can lead to feeling shameful and anxious in a lot of ways. And that can cause them to physically withdraw or isolate themselves, or even just deny their overall emotions and just be empty and distant.
Yeah, I think I read somewhere that narcissists are, it's a disorder of being avoidant of intimacy.
Mm-hmm.
So if that's the case, you know, you can get trapped in these things, and not until it's a daily life do you realize that this person really doesn't know how to be intimate.
And that's the thing that happens, is they live in their persona oftentimes. So they can be driven by insecurity, fear, distrust. And if they're trying at all costs to avoid this, then what ends up happening is, it's like, if you're avoiding it, you know what happens when you avoid something? It comes back. You know, it's going to come back with a vengeance, right? A self-fulfilling prophecy. So this is kind of what happens with narcissists, especially with this particular trait. So that's important to remember.
You know, we should probably here talk about the setup for this, because as I always tell you, if you have one in the family, you probably have 10 in the family. And I think part of it is modeling, but I suspect there's another piece that may be genetic.
Well, I think so too. I think that we know that with the environment, that they at a young age, they may have sought approval by a very conditional type of parent. So this has happened with the narcissistic survivors I've had. They've spoken of this in that way with regards to the parent always having that type of conditional love. Well, you're working extra hard as a child to try to figure out, well, what does that parent want? You know, and it becomes very clear what that is. So eventually you end up mimicking what they want. So you gain that sense of approval and feel good feeling. So that's one of the environmental
factors. You know, that's all you know. So you think that's love.
Yeah, exactly. And we can't rule out the genetic factor, because we know that psychopathy, for example, can be inherited. So it is a trait that can exist, that is biological in some cases. So I think that it could be safe to say that narcissism also could be inherited, and you see this also from one generation to the next.
In the survey responses, so many people said, my mother was a narcissist and my sister has the same qualities. So you see that.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is it's much more prevalent than ever before. And because it is essentially an attachment disorder, there must be something in the way in which we are now parenting or not parenting that's contributing to it.
I would agree. I think that in some ways, if people aren't careful, they can have an unchecked sense of self-esteem, and this is where we could find, for example, the sense of grandiose fantasy, which is another trait that's very present. You'll notice that they're very high in self-esteem when it comes to that. And I want to make a small distinction, because self-enhancement and grandiose fantasy resemble themselves a lot. But I think that the difference is that grandiose fantasy is what people are capable of and how they perceive others as seeing them, versus self-enhancement as being how they see themselves. So just a small distinction there. But I mean, grandiose fantasy is basically overestimating their abilities and convinced that they can do anything. And oftentimes you'll find that if they don't have what they want to have as an end goal, they'll say, I'll have it in the future. They're convinced utterly in their own minds that they'll have it, and they look down at people that oppose or disagree with them, because it doesn't validate their own point of view. And they tend to make themselves out into experts in several or all fields. So it's really interesting when you have a conversation with somebody like that, because it really looks as if the world revolves around them. And they even think that people continue to talk about them even when they're not there.
Well, some of our political figures seem to have exactly those traits.
Yes, and that's the thing, why sometimes it might not be as obvious. Perhaps in some areas in society, it's well looked upon to be ambitious. It's well looked upon to perhaps have some narcissistic traits, you know, so that may be why it may not have been noticed necessarily in some areas, but now we're having the conversation, it's coming out more.
Yeah, I think that's why these conversations and these episodes are so important, because people have to become more and more aware of this so that they don't buy into this kind of false self and deceptive behavior.
Exactly. I think that that's really important to recognize that, because it is a persona and it is something that they largely create within themselves. And it's, yeah, it's important not to fall into some of those traps. I think that that's especially important. And another trait that is important to mention is devaluing. And narcissists tend to basically blame others and will never share the responsibility if somehow something has failed. So very cutthroat, let's put it that way. We'll say it that way, in the sense that they'll blame somebody entirely, even if it's a shared responsibility. It won't be easy for them to admit fault, because that's very painful.
And if this is your sibling, how do you work with this?
And this is the thing I was thinking about also with regards to this particular trait. If you talk about a difficult situation and how that made you feel, most people would say, well, I'm sorry, I'm sorry that this has happened. I'll make an effort in the future to make sure this doesn't happen again. Narcissists will not do that. Narcissists will spin it around, make it about the other person, have no accountability when it comes to their contribution to the problem. So it becomes very, very difficult to have that conversation.
Well, what it does is it guarantees stuckness. There's no growth. I'm right, you're wrong, there's nothing to talk about.
Exactly, and that type of rigidity can lead to self-doubt, as we've talked about in other episodes, the type of shutting down that we can sometimes have because of shame shifting and things of that nature. So it's really important to recognize that that has to do with them more than us.
Well, and then of course it gets, and this is a topic for another episode, but then it gets into your response to that, which is all often, because you want to sustain that relationship, enabling.
Yeah, exactly. And they seek out people that are very empathic also, because they'll seek out somebody that has what they don't have. So basically, you hear often that people have given of themselves so much in relationships with them, and it's like they're depleted, they're emptied out, and this is unfortunately a common side effect of having to live with a narcissist or work with somebody that way also. So, yeah. And another trait also, and it's the last trait that's mentioned, is the entitlement rage that people have. Now, this is something that perhaps a lot of us with our sibling relationships, we may have experienced. The notion of extreme anger, disproportionately aggressive behavior, passive aggressiveness, and this is all being experienced by the narcissist with regards to just outwardly portraying the sense of insufficiency, shame, vulnerability that they have, because they're not being acknowledged in the way they would hope to be. So whenever they're not given that special treatment, then they'll lash out invariably, and that really is their worst fear. So,
I don't know. I don't see a lot of hope in terms of a sibling relationship that's has a narcissist in the mix.
well, let's keep in mind also that we gain power as we grow older, as we become adults, as we go from children to adolescence to adulthood. So it's important to remember that you're not that same person, nor are you the person that they make you out to be. So that's why reclaiming one's identity is especially important.
But I do want to say that that's what makes it so difficult when you have a narcissistic sibling, because you're mired and you have a tendency to regress when you're in that person's company to the person you were as a child. So it's a really difficult dance to maintain your adult self around a narcissistic sibling.
It can be, and I think that this is a good ending point on it, because I know that we're almost out of time here. But I do think that it's important also just to remember that in the end, that it's more about them, And it's more about recognizing how you can empower yourself because of the traits that we've identified. It's about recognizing what may have happened in the relationship that caused it to turn sour and why things are the way they are today. So,
well, and what you can expect. What can you really expect if your narcissistic sibling consistently behaves in this transactional, unempathetic way?
absolutely. So boundaries are very important in all cases, of course, and treating people the way we'd like to be treated, of course, but again, protecting ourselves when that's not the case. So.
Well, always enlightening to be with you. Thank you, Ali John.
Thank you so much for being here, Fern. I look forward to us doing another episode on this particular topic and others that will follow up soon. So I really appreciate you being here. Thank you again for bringing this out in the open. I think this conversation needs to happen, and we'll keep that going. So thank you again.
Great. See you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.